Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Rebuttal podcast, where we break down case law, comedy, and chaos in the legal field. Today's episode is about pay to stay. It's a common saying. You do the crime, you do the time. In a democratic society, you atone for your mistakes by serving time in prison for certain offenses. Most people in America grew up believing that going to prison itself wasn't a death sentence, that it wouldn't necessarily ruin your entire life, if only for your own behavior and actions, right? The state forces you to atone for your misgivings, for your mistakes. But after that, you are able to rebuild your life. What if I told you that the United States ensures, almost guarantees that you cannot? When Teresa Beatty's mother died in 2020, the state of Connecticut filed a notice in probate court demanding approximately 35%, over $83,000 of Beatty's inheritance. From 2000 until 2002, Teresa Beatty was incarcerated for a minor drug offense in the state of Connecticut. 20 years later, the state wanted reimbursement for Beatty's room and board under its prison debt law. While $83,762.26 will not make or break the state of Connecticut's multi-billion-dollar budget, the loss will be devastating to Miss Beatty, she said in a lawsuit that she filed back in 2022. But Miss Beatty is not alone in being held financially liable for the costs of incarceration. 45 states out of 50 have pay-to-stay, quote-unquote, statutes. Today, as you listen to this episode, there are almost 2 million people locked away in one of the more than 5,000 prisons or jails that dot the American landscape. While they are behind bars, these incarcerated people can be found standing in line at their prison's commissary waiting to buy some extra food or cleaning supplies that are often marked up to prices higher than one would pay outside of those prison walls. Many incarcerated people rely on electronic tablets to email a friend or family member, take an online class, or listen to music downloaded on the device. They will pay for these services and often even the device. And almost everyone who works at a job while incarcerated, often for less than $1 per hour, will find that the prison is taken a portion of their salary to pay for their cost of incarceration, upwards of 80% of their wages that are already a few cents on the dollar. This is the reality for those who are put behind bars, whether it be for the most minor of offenses or the most heinous, quote unquote, that we call them. And it doesn't end there. It is also the reality for the millions of their family members who are on the hook for paying their fees. Across the United States, the criminal justice system is becoming both more private and more expensive. Some prison systems have come to rely on private contractors for electronic monitoring, probation, pretrial services, and incarceration services. At the same time, criminal justice fees are exploding, including fees charged to inmates for their, quote, room and board while in prison. Some take into account an inmate's ability to pay the fees or the effect on their families. Some, if not most, do not. Some only apply to prisoners with paying jobs. Some apply to every prisoner. What they all have in common is this: these fees are imposed on convicted offenders who are statistically likely to be low income and therefore less likely to be able to pay. Because of this reality, the effects of pay-to-stay systems can be devastating, even when the crime is comparatively minor and the sentence is relatively short. Take the example of George Richey, a Missouri man who spent 3 months in jail after a misdemeanor conviction. Richey was credited with time served and was also required to pay board bills for his time in the St. Clair County Jail. These board bills are per diem, meaning per day fees collected from inmates by local governments for the cost of their imprisonment. In the state of Missouri, conviction of a Class A misdemeanor, mind you, carries with it a potential sentence to 1 year in jail and a fine of up to $2,000. During his time in jail, however, Richey accrued a $3,150 bill, well over the statutorily allowable fine for his underlying conviction. After he was released, Richey was ordered by the same county court to pay for his stay in prison, but he failed to do so, and so he was reincarcerated. Richey was charged an additional $2,275 for this second stay. After being released, Richey paid $1,600 to the county over 2 years. Mind you, they are garnishing his wages if he's making any wages at all in prison, and then on top of that, charging him those costs. How are you supposed to pay them back? What life do you have to set yourself up for success in that scenario. Prison is unaffordable for everyone except for those who are wealthy, who are well off enough to be able to pay it and bounce and not have a problem. Yet our entire foundation, the foundation of a justice system that is wrought with present injustices, was that the poor and the rich be treated the same. They are not. It is a crime on top of any other crime that you may or may not have committed in this country but are sent to prison for to be poor, period. By the time Richey was released again, his debt was higher than it had been before he began paying it down. He still could not afford to pay it. Describing the difficulty of breaking out of this cycle of criminal justice debt, Richey lamented that, quote, "It's like trying to shovel in a blizzard." Finally, the court told him his bill would only be dismissed if he agreed to serve a second 90-day jail stay. In other words, the only way to escape his pay-to-stay debt was to volunteer to serve double the time for his original crime. How is this constitutional? How is this legal? America. Though the Missouri Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of Richey in essentially saying that Missouri could not indeed do this, it did not effectively outlaw all pay-to-stay laws across the state of Missouri or the entire United States itself. 45 states today still require those who have served time to pay, quote unquote, for their stay in more than just room and board fees. And even people who want to play the devil's advocate, despite the fact that the devil never hired y'all and thinks you're washed. Oh, well, they should have to pay, right? They should have to pay. Why is it the taxpayers' problem? Why is it? I will explain to you exactly why. These fees, never infinity, actually help pay for the stay that the state is claiming they need the money for. It's just, all sixes. It all evens out at the end because that's the money that we put into having you stay there. No, incorrect. In the 2019 fiscal year, Connecticut collected $6 million in incarceration fees out of the $57 million owed on all liens. The $6 million in collected fees represents less than 1% of the state's $632 million overall corrections budget. I'm sick to my stomach. Please use that figure anytime you want to bring this up to someone and they say, well, they have to pay for their time. They literally aren't. They're not. I don't know where this money's going, but surely not back to our communities, not back to these people to rebuild their lives, not back to the state, not back to taxpayers. Less than 1%. Yeah. But also, taxpayers are not the ones actually harmed by the inability for these prisoners to pay. Because in reality, pay to stay is actually a relatively new invention that we've created to simply just be more cruel and actually not even help our bottom line. Are you shocked? Color me shocked. Color me gasped. In 2011, Robin Sanders was driving home when she saw the blue and red lights flashing behind her. She knew she had not fixed her muffler and believed that was why she was being pulled over. She thought she might be getting a ticket. Instead, Sanders, who lived in Illinois, was arrested and taken to jail. As she was booked and processed, she learned that she had been jailed because she owed debt, $730 to be precise, related to an unpaid medical bill. Unbeknownst to her, a collection agency had filed a lawsuit against her, and having never received the notice instructing her to appear, she had missed her date in court. Deborah Shoemaker Ford, a citizen of Harpersville, Alabama, spent 7 weeks in the county jail without ever appearing in court. Her crime was a failure to pay the monthly fees mailed to her by a private probation company called Judicial Correction Services. She was on probation because of a traffic violation. In Benton County, Washington, a quarter of those in jail are there because they owe fines and fees. And in Ferguson, Missouri, simmering anger with the police and court system has given rise to a pair of lawsuits aimed at the local practice of imprisoning indigent debtors. The American tradition of debtors' imprisonment seems to be alive and well. But how could that be? Jailing the indigent for their failure to meet contractual obligations was considered primitive by ancient Greek and Roman politicians and remains illegal and unheard of in most developed countries. Under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, the practice is listed as a civil rights violation. In the United States, debtors' prisons were banned under federal law in 1833. A century and a half later, in 1983, the Supreme Court affirmed that incarcerating indigent debtors was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Yet, Citizens like Sanders and Ford are, to this day, routinely jailed after failing to repay debt. Though traditional debtors' prisons are a thing of the past, de facto debtors' imprisonment is not. So what do we really know about modern-day debtors' imprisonment? How has it returned? When and where? What are pay-to-stay statutes in 45 states? Why do these states implement it? And is it actually helping with the cost of imprisonment, of incarcerating over 2 million people in this country as you listen to this episode right now? Is it all that it's cracked up to be to avoid continuously putting people on a cycle of imprisonment? Let's find out. Pay-to-stay programs, first and foremost, what are they? Are sometimes lumped under the umbrella term correctional fees, but they are a relatively new phenomenon that began in the latter part of the 20th century. In 1988, 48 states were utilizing a form of corrections fees, 26 of which were charging fees directly to jail inmates. Generally, pay-to-stay fees are, quote, non-criminal fees, assessed under various fee schedules, which charge inmates directly for the costs of their incarceration. There are two general schemes under which fees are assessed: booking fees and daily fees. Booking fees, sometimes referred to as a processing or reception fee, are a one-time charge assessed upon an individual's arrival at a correctional facility, while daily or per diem fees, as the name suggests, are assessed for each day the inmate is incarcerated. Per diem fees are often equivalent to an inmate's total daily room and board cost. However, many programs that do not shift the entire cost of housing an inmate assess additional fees a la carte for items such as substance abuse treatment, medical care, and meals. Pay-to-stay programs, the rationale behind them, though the reality is a lot different, are designed to bolster state and local budgets and do not replace traditional criminal sanctions such as fines and restitution. They still have to pay the criminal fines associated with their conviction, okay, in addition to restitution to potential victims, all right? Do not think for a moment. I do not want to hear a single person while you are listening to this podcast hit me with the, well, if you don't want to do the time, you shouldn't do the crime stuff. The crimes that these people may or may not have committed, because the plea bargaining process in this country is also incredibly corrupt and incredibly unjust. A lot of innocent people go to prison because it is quite literally too much of a gamble for them to try to basically pray and hope that the jury finds them innocent. A jury would find them innocent when they don't even know what evidence is stacked against them. So they will plead down to 1 to 5 years instead of 5 to 10. Yeah, they are already paying the fine associated with the conviction, the restitution they are required to pay back pursuant to typically a judge's order, and serving their sentence in prison. That they don't have any money shouldn't be something that we either force them to feel, right? If they had money before, well, now we want you to go broke. We want you to not have any chance and opportunity once you get outside of prison, once you're released from prison. We want this sentence to basically continue and haunt you for the rest of your life. We don't want you to be rehabilitated. We don't want you to even feel like you are ever not under a crippling amount of debt and stress. And we also want your family members and your loved ones tied to you to also have to pay this shit off. We don't want you to have a chance. And people in this country, if they knew how much we stack the cards against anyone, no matter how slight of a crime they go to prison for, people would be more outraged. We should be protesting in the streets about this. We should have been doing it since the 80s when this pay-to-stay program started catching on. But nobody cares about prisoners until you become one, until someone you know becomes one. You think that everything's just and fine. You think, oh, well, they're getting criminals off the streets. That is not the reality. They are burying regular people 6 feet under who just want to be treated like humans. And just because your mistakes in your life, as you're listening to this podcast, wherever you may be, have not translated to a prison sentence or county jail time, arrest, two or three, okay, maybe even just one, does not mean that you are somehow higher than thou, better than a person who might have a record. Life is long, and there are a whole lot of laws that you could break. We are a law-drenched country. Thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands of laws are applied to you at any moment in time. You might not even realize it. Even if, from arrest to conviction, the system is perfectly just, everyone does their jobs properly, there is no exculpatory evidence that the prosecution is hiding, even if you actually did do something and you went to prison for it, that should be the end of it, but it is only the beginning. Because pay-to-stay programs do not replace the criminal fees and sanctions and restitution and fines that they are required to pay regardless, and then the pay-to-stay fees are stacked on top of that, it leaves many inmates with significant debts upon their re-entry into society that would be, for a regular person, like I said, making normal wages, just crippling. Many of these programs came into existence in the midst of skyrocketing prison populations due to the aftermath of failed and costly policies such as the war on crime and three strikes laws. The United States currently boasts the highest prison population in the world, housing nearly 2.2 million inmates nationwide. To illustrate, roughly 716 out of every 100,000 Americans are incarcerated. In other words, while the United States makes up approximately 5% or less of the world's total population, it houses almost a quarter of the world's prisoners. When comparing our incarceration rate to our more comparable NATO allies, our rates dwarf theirs. Great Britain is the NATO country with the next highest incarceration rate, and our rate is still more than 4 times as large. Russia incarcerates its citizens at a rate almost 40% lower than the United States. Despite having the second highest incarceration rate, our country is only 44th on the crime index rating. Further, and unsurprisingly, evidence suggests that imprisonment does little to reduce the crime rate. Other evidence shows that prison has a criminogenic effect, meaning that imprisonment can actually lead people to commit more crimes after release. Prisons offer little rehabilitative programming and often release individuals back to communities without money, job prospects, access to social safety nets, or funding to pursue higher education, leaving them vulnerable and likely to re-offend. Research shows that 39% of the prison population is incarcerated despite just presenting no threat to public safety, and alternatives to incarceration would be effective for at least 25% of the current prison population. As a result, incarceration can increase re-offense and at times offer no benefit to public safety. Faced with literally insurmountable prison populations, many state departments of corrections, as well as county jails, turn to programs like Pay to Stay in an attempt to temper rising budgets. As of 2015, at least 43 states statutorily authorized charging incarcerated individuals for room and board. As of 2025, it is 45 states. According to the ACLU of Ohio, these fees are insidious, loading formerly incarcerated people with increasing amounts of debt that make it nearly impossible for even the most well-meaning person to become a productive member of society. Thank you. If you want people to actually contribute to society in a meaningful way that goes beyond the literal dollars that they have in their pocket at the moment that they make a mistake, and also throughout the time that you keep them in prison, this is not the way to do it. Sorry to say. And if you implement a program that basically guarantees that the only people who actually are able to avoid it or immediately get out from under it are people who are wealthy, yeah, that is not a good policy. Historically speaking, not great, I fear. While incarcerated, the fees are usually taken from a prisoner's commissary fund, which is often funded by their family to allow their loved ones to purchase phone cards or small comforts to make their stay more bearable. Once released from jail, the debts are often handed over to collections agencies that hound the person until they pay. If they cannot pay, the debt is reported to the credit agency, effectively making it impossible to gain employment, housing, transportation, and so much more. Pay-to-stay fees hinder rehabilitation, period, and are non-responsive to the government's stated interest in assessing them. The stated purpose that states give when they are defending these pay-to-stay programs in court is to bolster offender accountability beyond the accountability already assessed by the fines, the minimum respective fines they have to pay pursuant to the conviction they already have and the time served. What? Also, the government interest alleged in much of the constitutional litigation surrounding pay-to-stay fees is teaching prisoners, quote, financial responsibility. I wish I was joking. I wish this was a bit. Are you out of your mind? How do I teach my child financial responsibility? Oh, by the time they turn 8, garnish their wages and make sure that they're stressed out all the time and make sure that they never get to keep any of the money that they make. Be responsible. That's how you do it. This doesn't teach you financial responsibility. It teaches you that you should either kill yourself or commit some insane tax evasion. And that's just a fact. Because what the hell? Moreover, the nameless taxpayer that the policymakers, the politicians, the sheriff's departments, the corrections facilities point to as benefiting from these pay-to-stay programs, as definitely not feeling the financial burden as much. for paying for these prisons, for this mass incarceration epidemic problem that we have in this country. It turns out that the nameless, faceless taxpayer that is none of us and all of us at the same time is the one individual that is excluded entirely from this process. Criminal punishment has long been viewed by some as having an expressive function. That is, punishment serves as an expression of the community's condemnation. Jewel Feinberg's view of the expressive function of punishment sees the government as the principal acting on behalf of the people. Others have incorporated this expressive function of punishment into broader theories of democratic criminal justice. Regardless of the extent to which individuals ought to participate in the adjudication or punishment process, the criminal system should reflect the will of the people whom the government represents. Lawmakers' passage of pay-to-stay statutes and entry into contracts with for-profit prisons were ostensibly for the benefit of the parsimonious taxpayer. Yet, perhaps ironically, the combination of pay-to-stay laws and private prisons harm the community at large by undermining the democratic and expressive functions of the criminal system. Even though there is debate on the place of society in the criminal system, it is generally accepted that society plays some role in the state's adjudication of crimes and administration of punishment. Society has a collective privilege and responsibility to participate in its criminal system, and this includes participation in both the administration and funding of its penal system. When states seek reimbursement from the formerly or currently incarcerated person for the costs of incarceration, they often cite the taxpayer as a person who is harmed if the state is unsuccessful in its effort to recoup the costs. This framing improperly vilifies the incarcerated person and portrays the taxpayers as victims of the incarcerated person's failure, or more likely, inability to pay. This characterization of the taxpayer as someone who should be free from the burdens of funding incarceration is just simply wrong, because it is the taxpayer's right and duty to participate in the funding of punishment if the taxpayer's wishes are being adjudicated through this form of punishment. Everyone knows that part of what they pay for with respect to taxes, etc., okay, is going to a criminal justice system, is going to the function of our courts, of our government, of our, in some part, our prisons. Even though funding incarceration might be a right that the taxpayer would prefer to avoid, it is an important recognition of the citizen's role in and responsibility for the criminal system. And this is not me saying that prisons are great and we should fund them all the time, blah, blah, blah. This is not me even discounting the abolitionist movement, prison abolitionist movement. This is me just laying out the policy and facts and rationale and purpose of the system as it stands right now, okay? So this is me laying out what should effectively and does obliterate the arguments and claimed purpose of the government in initiating and enforcing these pay-to-stay programs, okay? Don't get it twisted. You do the crime, you do the time, and that time costs money, and you do the crime, you do the time, and you do the fine, and you do the fee, and then you do another fine, and you do a fee, and then you do the room and board and the per diem. Like, if we want a society with rules and laws that are enforced through imprisonment, and I'm not saying I want that or that it's the perfect system, okay? In theory, you cannot force anyone who is held responsible in that system to pay for it and in turn stay on a cycle of incarceration, because the idea that these incarcerated persons are even able to pay these fines, even a significant percentage of the time, is also ignorant. Like, we act as if pay-to-stay programs are just raking in revenue. It's literally raking in nothing. It's people who are quite literally, this is the correct verb, slaving away to parse together, to put together even a few $100s on an insurmountable thousands and thousands upon thousands of dollars debt that is accruing over years of time, up to $225 per day in prison on average, when that person could be using that money to better their life, to get their shit together, to buy a new uniform for their job, to spend it on their kids and their family, to do literally anything but dump it into a nothingless pit. A nothing pit, not nothingless. There is a lot of nothing in there, right? Criminal punishment can be conceptualized as a remedy for a harm to society, and it is therefore essential that society democratically participate in that remedy, or at the very least, that the state act on behalf of the people. However, with for-profit, privately owned prisons, you eliminate the community and local government deterrent from the imposition of punishment through these private corrections. When that happens, much of the value of the expressive value of community punishment is lost. These values include democratic legitimacy, the retributive value of punishment, and restorative justice. When private prisons administer punishment, the state has abdicated the right to remedy the harms caused to the people. The state thus assumes the role of a mere conduit, while separating and insulating society from the harms and practice of punishment. Pay-to-stay laws require the person who experienced or is experiencing incarceration to be responsible for funding that incarceration. States' contracts with private prisons delegate the administration of punishment to a private entity. The combination of pay-to-stay laws and private prisons thus excludes the capital P people from participating in both the funding and expression of condemnation by the citizenry. If punishment is intended, at least in part, to function as an expression of condemnation by the citizenry, if this is really your justified purpose, then the citizenry should be recognized as stakeholders in the process by paying for it with tax dollars and having the government that represents them administer the punishment itself. And by giving back to the taxpayers and community and this whole we're all in this together, the capital P people idea, by not ensuring that any person who is the people, because do not get it twisted, every single one of the 2 million people who are in prison or jails right now, today, in America, in our country, sitting there, is part of the capital P people. There is no us and other. There is no them and we. We are all one part of the people. And so to claim that you are benefiting the capital B people by ensuring that members of the capital B people who absolutely have a chance and should have the privilege and right to redeem themselves and to face their punishment and serve their time, take the consequence for their actions, and then be free of it in at least as many respects as is reasonable, to be able to have a shot at coming back to society and still believing that the capital P people don't want the worst for them, to benefit the capital P people, to have a stake in the game for the capital P people to get better, to give back, etc. Why would this be ever a benefit, to just continuously punish beyond what we've even allowed and what they've already I mean, God, enough. Within these contracts, the private prisons, motivated by capitalist economics, are incentivized to cut costs wherever possible, which often leads to an even lower standard of living than that experienced by those who are incarcerated in public prisons. States enter these contracts with the intention of reducing the cost of incarceration. However, private prisons do not result in appreciable cost savings to the state and its taxpayers. They do not believe the politicians and the corrections departments and the sheriff's departments and all of these people who advocate for it, tough on crime, quote unquote, who lied to you and say that this saves money. It does not. To the extent that the private prison can operate at a lower cost than public facilities, these savings are subsumed in corporate profits. Those savings are subsumed in corporate profits, which are enjoyed only by corporate shareholders because these are for-profit prisons. Importantly, the private prison makes its own decisions about how much it will pay for operating the prison facility, and those decisions in turn affect the fee that the state ultimately assesses to the incarcerated person as their, quote, cost of incarceration. The private person's determination of operational costs matters with respect to the level of care the incarcerated person receives, but it also matters because that person is not a party to the contract and instead is treated more like a term or object of the contract. So if you think that the money that these people, if they even can pay pursuant to these pay-to-stay programs, right, their, quote, room and board, daily fee, $225 a day for being in prison, you think that oh, well, they're paying for their stay. They are literally paying money that was dumped into shareholder profits, that was dumped into corporate pockets. Rather than addressing the costs of mass incarceration by reducing incarceration, the state has created a system wherein the state has shifted the responsibility of running the prisons to private corporations and has passed along the costs it promises to pay under those contracts to the person experiencing incarceration. Like the taxpayer, the state recedes into the background of the punishment it is responsible for imposing. Not to mention, in the United States, the harmful effects of the criminal justice system disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities. We all know this by now. If you've listened to this podcast, you very much know it, but this is just to underscore that point before we get to it later. Likewise, this is true for the fines and fees regime. Fines and fees are legal financial obligations, LFOs, that extract financial resources from people involved in the criminal system. But often, the ones who ultimately shoulder the burden of paying these debts are the families and communities of the named debtor, aka the incarcerated person, rather than the obligor himself. Thus, the government's use of legal financial obligations broadly extracts resources from communities that are disproportionately Black and disproportionately poor, ensnaring them deeper in the carceral web than may initially appear. The prison pipeline is not straight. It is a circle. And we have made it that way. We have built it that way. That is the way that it functions by choice. In Michigan alone, the state is entitled to 90% of one's assets and can seize assets normally protected from collection, such as pensions and Social Security benefits. For incarcerated individuals subject to these fees, the amounts can reach into the hundreds of thousands, and their collection can represent the totality of their financial assets. I'm sick. States argue the legality of these practices by framing fees as reasonable reimbursement for the expenses incurred by their incarceration, quote unquote. However, a study conducted on the state of Illinois, at least in 2024, found that historically the money collected did not necessarily go directly back to the Department of Corrections. And in the other 44 states that still enforce pay-to-stay programs and statutes, it is no different. The funds collected went into a general state fund that was then distributed to a number of agencies to serve the state's needs in agriculture, health and family services, and juvenile justice, in addition to corrections. These fees collected from incarcerated individuals went to satisfy other budget shortfalls rather than reimbursing the state. Additionally, state budgets already include large amounts of funding for the operation of prisons. Beyond extracting disproportionately from this vulnerable population, the state is collecting funds for expenses it is likely already funded through state tax dollars and other revenue. Now, I note that as of June 2025, Illinois and California have outlawed a form of these pay-to-stay statutes of these programs. Illinois' recent reforms to the pay-to-stay program has been seen as notable and a possible benchmark for how other states will go about reforming their systems and making them better, if not completely outlawed entirely, which would be great. But I cannot emphasize enough that these programs disproportionately affect and impact Black and Brown communities. Sometimes, pay-to-stay fees are charged and collected during incarceration and automatically deducted from individuals' wages or prison accounts. However, because many incarcerated individuals are not able to fully pay off these fees during their sentences, the fees often accumulate as debt that they are still responsible for following their release after time served. In other instances, incarcerated individuals are not notified of the fees during their incarceration, and the fees are then collected by the state following their release by garnishing wages, seizing assets, or using collections agencies. Considering the country's longstanding racial disparities in arrests and sentencing, the impact of pay-to-stay fees is disproportionately felt by low-income Black and Brown communities. People who enter the criminal legal system in the U.S. are overwhelmingly poor and disproportionately Black and Brown, a deeply disturbing outcome stemming from historical disinvestment, the criminalization of poverty, and the over-policing of Black and Brown communities. A 2022 study found that in 2016, individuals who identify as Black comprised 34% of state prison populations, despite representing only 12% of the entire United States population, while individuals who identify as Hispanic comprised 21% of the state prison populations while accounting for only 17% of the U.S. population. Research further suggests that a significant share of incarcerated individuals experience the effects of poverty and family disruption prior to incarceration, including homelessness, living in public housing, receiving public assistance, and or spending time in foster care. The people who are incarcerated should not be demonized. We should be demonizing the society that put them there, that kept them on the track to be there. The vast majority of people who are incarcerated right now, the over 2 million people that are sitting in state and federal prisons and jails right now, as you listen to me speak about it, are victims of a system that kept their victimization on track to go exactly back to prison or to stay in prison or to not break a cycle that could have been broken if they hadn't been set up to fail. Relatedly, and unsurprisingly, incarcerated people have a significantly lower median annual income prior to their incarceration than non-incarcerated people of similar ages. The socioeconomic conditions of individuals disproportionately impacted by incarceration is a critical backdrop for understanding the compounding harms that pay-to-stay fees can pose. Pay-to-stay policies, in effect, impose fees on individuals who are uniquely unable to pay them, thereby setting up incarcerated people and, by extension, their families, who often have to financially support them, for lasting debt and hardship. In Connecticut, for example, individuals imprisoned in state institutions had to pay $249 per day for room and board. These fees are all the more concerning when considering that incarcerated individuals, if and when employed while in prison, earn wages that often amount to less than $1 per hour. There are even 7 states where incarcerated individuals are not paid at all for most prison work. Consider a hypothetical scenario where John Doe, a fake person that we're naming for this hypothetical, is sentenced to 168 days in prison. While incarcerated, he is employed in a regular prison job at the correctional facility in which he is confined. Sometimes called facility or institutional support jobs, these are the most common forms of employment in prisons and include functions like custodial, laundry, groundskeeping, and food services. These jobs are distinct from working in prison industries, which are state-owned businesses that employ incarcerated people to produce goods and provide services sold to government agencies. These numbers and figures I'm going to give to you for our hypothetical John Doe are wage amounts, expenses, and medical copays that are the averages or the most common across all states. John is paid 63 cents per hour for his work that he performs while in prison for 168 days. That is the highest wage for a regular facility job available, 63 cents an hour. He works 30 hours a week, which is an average working week, and often you can't get more than that in some cases. So he makes $453.60 during the time that he is in prison. His expenses, he spends $18 per week, which is the average spending in the commissary for coffee and toiletries. He also has to spend $130 per month in phone calls, transportation, and other miscellaneous expenses. That brings his expense totals up to $1,212 even, just on his a la carte, what he has spent to survive in prison. His pay-to-stay fees, $5 medical copay twice, because our hypothetical John sprained his ankle while exercising and is charged for each visit to a clinic. And also $1,500 per month for his, quote, room and board, which is billed to him at $50 per day. His pay-to-stay fees therefore add up to be $9,010. After subtracting 100% of his income that he made in prison, every single dime he made while in prison goes to these fees and expenses. He owes, upon completion of his sentence walking out a free man, $9,768.40 for only 168 days in prison. Under such circumstances, you can understand how even paying a medical copay to see a physician, which typically hovers around $3 to $5 per visit, can be an enormous burden when you are only making 63 cents per hour. Deprived of any sources of livable income, incarcerated individuals have to contend not only with pay-to-stay fees, but also with a host of other fines and fees during incarceration and throughout their interaction with the criminal legal system more broadly. These include fees for clothing, transportation, and digital and telephone communication, as well as commissary markups for basic items like soap, coffee, and toothpaste, sometimes even toilet paper. Other fees that system-involved individuals may be responsible for include booking fees, attorney fees, examination fees, parole fees, and probation supervision fees, among many others. In addition to the trauma experienced during incarceration, these fees levied by the U.S. carceral system continue to keep individuals in cycles of poverty and incarceration. 38% of people surveyed in Alabama committed a second crime in order to pay off their court debt, according to a 2018 report. This is a quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates. When our elders presented school to us, they did not present it as a place of high learning, but as a means of escape from death and penal warehousing. From the moment they enter the prison gates, incarcerated people lose the right to refuse to work. This is because the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which protects against slavery and involuntary servitude, explicitly excludes from its reach those held in confinement due to a criminal conviction. The roots of modern prison labor can be found in the ratification of this exception clause at the end of the Civil War, which disproportionately encouraged the criminalization and effective re-enslavement of Black people during the Jim Crow era, with impacts that persist to this day. According to data collected by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the prison labor industry consists of 870,000 inmates. Of the 2 million people who are incarcerated at this time, right now, in the US. Today, more than 76% of incarcerated workers surveyed by the Bureau of Justice Statistics say that they are required to work or face additional punishment, such as solitary confinement, denial of opportunities to reduce their sentence, and loss of family visitation. They have no right to choose which type of work they do and are subject to arbitrary, discriminatory, and punitive decisions by the prison administrators who select their work assignments. U.S. law also explicitly excludes incarcerated workers from the most universally recognized workplace protections. Incarcerated workers are not covered by minimum wage laws or overtime protection, are not afforded the right to unionize, and are denied workplace safety guarantees. Incarcerated workers are paid pennies as prisons and state governments reap the benefits. Incarcerated workers typically earn little to no pay at all, with many making just pennies an hour. They earn on average between 13 cents and 52 cents per hour nationwide. Wages remain stagnant for years, even decades. In 7 states, incarcerated workers are not paid at all for the vast majority of work assignments. Yes, those states are all in the South. Are we shocked? Yet even these abysmal wages are not theirs to keep. The government takes up to 80% of these wages for room and board. Court costs, restitution, and other fees like building and sustaining prisons, these wage deductions generally leave incarcerated workers with less than half of their gross pay. Workers are left with even less disposable income because prison systems charge incarcerated people exorbitant cost for basic necessities like phone calls to loved ones, hygiene products, and medical care. Almost 70% of surveyed incarcerated workers said they were not able to afford basic necessities like toilet paper with their prison wages. Because incarcerated workers' wages are so low, families already struggling from the loss of income when a family member is incarcerated must step in to financially support an incarcerated loved one. Families with an incarcerated loved one spend $2.9 billion a year on commissary accounts and phone calls, and more than half of these families are forced to go into debt to afford these costs. At the same time, incarcerated workers produce real value for prison systems and state governments, the system's primary beneficiaries. Nationally, incarcerated workers produce more than $2 billion per year in goods and more than $9 billion per year in services for the maintenance of prisons. Further, more than 80% of prison laborers do prison maintenance work, which offsets the cost of our bloated prison system. Many prison workers are assigned to general janitorial duties like sweeping or mopping, while others are assigned to grounds maintenance, food preparation, laundry, and other work to maintain the very prisons that confine them. Another 8% of incarcerated workers assigned to public works projects maintain cemeteries, school grounds, and parks, do road work, construct buildings, clean government offices, clean up landfills and hazardous spills, undertake forestry work, and more. At least 30 states explicitly include incarcerated workers as a labor resource in their emergency operations plans for disasters and emergencies. Incarcerated firefighters also fight wildfires in at least 14 states. State-owned businesses employ 6.5% of incarcerated workers and produce over $2 billion in goods and services sold to other state entities annually. Less than 1% of workers are assigned to work for private companies, which generally offer higher pay but are still subject to exorbitant wage deductions. Prisons spend less than 1% of their budgets to pay wages to incarcerated workers, yet spend more than 2/3 of their budgets to pay prison staff. The revenues from commodities and services generated by imprisoned laborers prevent policymakers and the public from reckoning with the true fiscal costs of mass incarceration. Some government officials have even voiced opposition to efforts to reduce prison and jail populations precisely because it would reduce the incarcerated workforce. 2 million people right now in America are incarcerated. As you listen to this, prison policy should not be driven by a desire for cheap labor. Further, dangerous work conditions and preventable injuries are abound because, again, these workers do not have the protection that regular people do from OSHA in the public because they are slaves. Legalized slavery. A majority of incarcerated workers surveyed say that they received no formal job training, and many also say they worry about their safety while working. Incarcerated workers with minimal experience or training are often assigned hazardous work in unsafe conditions and without standard protective gear, leading to preventable injuries and deaths. Prisons don't keep good records on the number of incarcerated workers injured on the job, but California reported more than 600 injuries in its state prison industry program over a 4-year period, and that's just what they've reported. But, of course, because of poor data collection, this number likely severely underestimates the true impact of prison work on the health and safety of incarcerated workers. Workplace safety and labor laws explicitly exempt prison laborers from the protections that virtually all other workers enjoy. Incarcerated people sometimes work in inherently dangerous conditions that would be closely regulated by health and safety regulations and inspectors if they were not incarcerated. Some are exposed to dangerous toxins on the job. In numerous cases documented nationwide, injuries could have been prevented with proper training, machine guarding mechanisms, or personal protective equipment that would be standard in workplaces outside prisons. These inhumane dynamics are particularly extreme in the South, which incarcerates people, primarily Black men, at the highest rates in the entire world. and is more likely than other regions to force incarcerated people to work for nothing at all. Because southern state and local governments raise less tax revenue per capita than other regions, they rely more heavily on free or underpaid labor to operate costly prisons and produce goods and services on which the public sector depends. This reliance on free and underpaid labor is consistent with the racist and anti-worker Southern economic development model that has predominated the region since Reconstruction and before it. Because what labor were they relying on before Reconstruction, people? Think about it. 2 + 2 = slaves. Thank you. Prison labor not only masks the true cost of mass incarceration, but also locks states into inhumane, regressive, and inefficient forms of revenue generation while deepening racial inequities and imposing high fiscal and social costs on local economies. Nationwide, nearly 2 million people are confined in state and federal prisons, county jails, juvenile and immigrant detention centers, and other confinement facilities. Of the 1.2 million people incarcerated in state and federal prisons, nearly 800,000 are prison laborers, most of them by force. Out of the 2.2-ish million that are in prison right now, 457,000 of those people are not convicted, have never been convicted of the crime they are currently sitting in jail for. They are locked up awaiting trial. Why? Many are detained in local jails because they can't afford to pay the bail amount set to secure their release. The median bail amount for felonies is $10,000, which represents 8 months of income for a typical person detained because they can't pay bail. But jails are not the only places detaining people pre-trial. The federal government and other authorities detain at least another 27,000 people. Further, the prison banking system of it all makes their ability to pay back these pay-to-stay fees that are accruing against them, these debts, okay, that they most of the time don't even know are happening, okay, while they're in prison, makes it even more impossible to have any control over whether you are going to be destitute when you get out of prison. People in prison have no choice but to use the banking systems that prisons operate. Rather than use an outside bank account or have family or friends meet their daily needs directly, people in prison must rely on what are often called inmate trust accounts to pay for goods and services within the prisons. These accounts have long been vulnerable to asset seizure by the prisons that run them. The money in these accounts, however, comes from prison wages and deposits by friends and family members of incarcerated people. Prisons take this money in a variety of ways. They impose fees for a wide variety of services like making a phone call, receiving mail, participating in educational programming or treatment, or even using the banking system itself. Sell commissary items at highly marked up prices, exact fines as punishment for disciplinary infractions, divert money at the behest of courts and other criminal systems agencies to pay other fines and fees, and collect interest from the pooled accounts. I'm sick. Sometimes prisons seize large portions of an incarcerated person's trust account balance under the rationale that the individual owes the prison system for their daily room and board. Sometimes the money simply disappears as a result of embezzlement or error. Yup. To make up for their paltry wages and the pretty much guaranteed wage garnishment that's going to happen, all right, where their funds disappear, people in prison obviously often take part in a thriving underground economy of side hustles, bartering stamps or commissary items for everything from hand-drawn greeting cards to makeshift home cooking to legal help, and then obviously to get other illicit things as well. These are real quotes from various facilities across the United States. Quotes from people who are or have been incarcerated. This is all from October 2025, mind you. All of these quotes. This isn't, I'm not cherry picking from the most heinous, I'm cherry picking from the most recent. Quote, "At first, this place seemed all right, but now that I have been here almost a month, that perception is changing. They took me off of my 3 800 milligram ibuprofen tablets a day. Instead, gave me a nerve/psychotropic pill, which does not work for my pain. They also drew blood 3 times, took an x-ray, and ordered all kinds of tests. They didn't realize their mistake until 4 days later when they admitted they had overlooked all of the psychotropic meds I was already on. So finally, they were putting me in for a pain med and referring me to the pain management of a doctor. Mind you, the ibuprofen doesn't really work for my pain either, but at least it's something. I have osteomyelitis/MRSA in the hip. The infection has eaten so much of it away that I've been in a wheelchair since 2023. I also have end-stage bone arthritis. Because the infection was not treated when it first developed at the other prison facility they were at, it has totally eaten away my hip, making a hip replacement questionable. Plus, the infection is still present. On October 25th, an 80-year-old died in my facility after he fell and hit his head earlier in the day, yet all they did was bandage his head. They didn't send him to the hospital. When they saw that he was unresponsive at 9:26 p.m., they worked on him until 9:51 p.m. They ran out of supplies on the crash cart and ran around like chickens with their heads cut off trying to find what they needed. in the nurse's station. Another quote, we haven't been able to get books, Bibles, magazines, etc. for 6 months. The assistant warden announced this in May. It was verbal, nothing written, and we weren't refunded for our subscriptions. Another quote, one of my visitors was denied this weekend because an officer said her clothes were tainted with drugs, but the visitor has never used or touched drugs and she bought her clothes specifically for this visit. Another quote, at my facility, we still don't have heat on in the units. It was 33 degrees the other night. This prison has a steam heat system. Another quote, at Terry Hod FCI, we still don't have heat on in the units. It was 33 degrees the other night. Another quote, our lunch yesterday, 2 boiled eggs and a hamburger bun. That's it. Meanwhile, there are no utensils to eat with in the dining room. People are now eating with their hands. The United States not only disproportionately incarcerates poor people and people who are Black and brown, it also sentences poor people to deeper poverty, even more exacerbated by the pay-to-stay statutes, which ensure that these people are not able to earn any of their life back or a better life back for themselves after prison because they will be paying for their crimes beyond the price that was actually set by law by our society. Also, incarceration isn't just impoverishing the people who are incarcerated, it is impoverishing the families and communities of incarcerated people. Prisons never fix rural poverty. It deepens it, it guarantees it. Towns suffering from unemployment and deindustrialization, especially rural communities, are often sold the idea that prisons can help turn things around. But this story could not be further from the truth. Prisons actually deepen poverty in the communities where they are built, and they deepen poverty the most in the towns that are the most impoverished to begin with. Pay-to-stay statutes didn't come to the forefront of public attention, at least media attention, until about 2015, when a big news agency, I forget which one it was like Wall Street Journal-esque maybe, did a big expose on it. And for the most part, it was the first time people were hearing about it. And in large part because of the attention it received after that article was written, money has been put into studying just how badly this is affecting our country. And I'll tell you about it. Pay-to-stay statutes administered by state and local governments across the U.S. saddle millions of incarcerated individuals, past and present, with the bill for some or all of the cost of their imprisonment. But little research had been done on the impact these policies have on incarcerated people, their families, and their communities until now. Boosted by a $1.5 million grant from Arnold Ventures, April Fernandez, an associate professor of sociology at North Carolina State University, is co-leading a new research team called the Captive Money Lab, which I will link in the show notes below, which will analyze the relationship between the prison system, politics, and state finances. Fernandez and her collaborators note that pay to stay is a controversial practice. Research suggests that it contributes to widening inequalities in American society, with the outstanding balances for current and former incarcerated people approaching 6-figure amounts. What's more, because state and local governments' efforts to collect these fees are civil suits, defendants are not entitled to an attorney to even defend themselves or get that debt forgiven. The nonprofit organization Arnold Ventures has awarded the $1.5 million grant to launch the Captive Money Lab to Fernandez, Brittany Friedman of the University of Southern California, and Gabriella Kirk-Warner of Syracuse University. The 5-year funding pledge supports the research lab's mission to advance research policy and advocacy around the political economy of punishment, as well as the links between the prison system, politics, and state finances. That they received this grant, they reported on getting this grant in February of 2024. At captivemoneylab.org, you can read a little bit about their research into pay-to-stay programs, their commentary in the media, and their advocacy before state and federal government committees and hearings. My rebuttal for today's episode is that I urge you to look up your state's pay-to-stay laws, and if you can, let your lawmakers know how you feel about it. But staying informed is what matters, because most people don't know this, or else they'd be outraged too. If all this podcast episode does for you is inform you on how incarcerated people are treated like less than human in our society, and how more grace should be given to people who have records and how they are treated by their community, then this podcast episode has done its job. Because there are so many people, the majority of people in our prison system who have been impacted by our prison system today, who not only deserve redemption, but I believe our communities entitle them to that. If you are living in America, you should be entitled to an opportunity to redeem yourself, to pay for the consequences of your actions, and then be able to start again and to start better and to do better instead of staying in the cycle of incarceration And for those of you who have been impacted, because again, on top of the 2 million people who are incarcerated today, there are even more millions of people who are related to or connected to or related to victims of these crimes that were perpetrated because the person was kept by society in the cycle of incarceration, in the cycle of crime. There are so many more millions of people who are negatively impacted by the criminal system that I am also thinking of, because this doesn't just create, quote, criminals, it creates victims. And if you have been affected by the criminal system in this way, either because you have been a victim of a crime or you are someone who knows someone who is incarcerated, you have been incarcerated, I believe that everyone deserves to have justice. And right now, our system does not give justice to victims, and it definitely doesn't give justice to the incarcerated. So please treat them with the humanity that you would like to be granted if you were ever in a situation where your mistakes translated to prison time or jail time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Rebuttal Podcast. Stay safe, vote, and stay informed. See you soon.